Great. So today I'm going to be talking about an aspect of Mumbai's heritage that is perhaps a bit less apparent as you walk through the streets. Its environmental transformations that have taken place that have rendered modern Mumbai very different from the early history. I'm going to refer to the colonial era, Mumbai's Bombay here. And I'm talking about maps, I'm talking about mapping this early history and this early city, but also thinking about how people at the time understood the place and the environment of Bombay and why they thought that. I'm actually going to start this story in the 1830s and then move back from there. So 1830s Bombay was booming. It was the town was expanding rapidly. This is an era, and we have an image here from 1816 of the city. This is before the railway. It's before the cotton boom, but in the 1830s, Bombay is still expanding quite rapidly, and people are becoming more and more interested in the city's history. People such as an Irish newspaper editor in the city called Robert Murphy. And he was also an amateur historian interested in a very kind of colonial way, tracing the different peoples of Bombay's history and kind of categorizing them. And he went about this through looking at old manuscripts, particularly Marathi Bakhar's chronicles. And in doing so, he stumbled upon something that he wasn't looking for that surprised him. So we have a quote here. This is Robert Murphy talking. One conclusion, however, I was led to by reading the manuscripts, for which I was at the time quite unprepared, namely, that the present island of Bombay formed in the year 1295 AD at least two distinct islands. For Mahim is mentioned as a distinct island of itself, and Bombay as if it were altogether another place. Now, this is something that Murphy has no knowledge of before this point, and he presents this to the Bombay Geographical Society in 1836, and this is news to those people of Bombay who are interested in the city's history. They are unaware of the idea that this island was once multiple islands, which might surprise us because today anyone interested in the early history of the city might be aware that this was once multiple islands. So the image that we see here, the map, shows what is called the island of Bombay. It's called that. That's the name of the map, and it refers to, excluding Colaba, which by this point was not quite merged with the city, this island, one island, and that's how people at the time thought of Bombay, the island of Bombay. So to discover that Mahim, which is to the north, was once a separate island, was quite surprising. And Murphy continues to do research, and he analyzes the place names and the etymologies of the place names and comes up with a theory that once the Bombay was split into seven. And this map is of the seven islands of Bombay. So Mahim is a separate island, but also he concludes the islands themselves split even further. Bombay itself is the H-shaped island to the south and was once separate from all these other islands. Now, the question for our talk today, the puzzle, is how did Robert Murphy not know this in 1836? Not know that Bombay was once an archipelago of seven. The fact that the seven islands of Bombay were fused together through land reclamation is really a central pillar of the city's origin story. And in fact, the most common version of this story is that reclamation was achieved in 1784. And that's only 50 years before Murphy's research. So how does he, seemingly completely unaware of an event that was only 50 years ago? And this is the story of reclamation that's most commonly told, which is that the governor of Bombay, William Hornby, against the wishes of the East India Company authorities, undertook this reclamation and built the seawall that this is an image of here, that united the islands together. And the quote is, "At last, Governor Hornby, having only about 13 months more to serve, commenced the work without sanction, knowing full well that he could finish it before the Court of Directors could possibly interfere." So those are the East India Company authorities in London. The Honourable Court of Directors were excessively irate. So it's this quite heroic story of defying the authority and going and undertaking this transformation kind of sneakily, and then resigning. He's meant to have kept hold of the order for him to step down until the reclamation was finished so that he could make sure it was done. Now, so this is 1784. Murphy's writing in 1836. Our puzzle is, how is it possible that in only 50 years, this major environmental transformation had vanished from memory? That's what I'm going to be answering today. And the first job we need to do is actually debunk this story that I just outlined. So to begin with, this story about valiant Governor Hornby is not true, in that it's placed at the wrong time. Hornby had nothing to do with this seawall, even though it's called the Hornby Vellard. That seems to be a name that came up later alongside this story. Actually, this seawall that we're seeing an image of here was built in the 1720s, not the 1780s. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail later. So perhaps that helps with this mystery of Murphy not knowing. Now we have 100 years between the land reclamation event and that memory being lost under Murphy. But that's not the whole story. To understand how the British forgot that Bombay was once multiple islands, we need to delve into a history of geography and environmental change, which is full of myths and misinformation, just like this story. There are others that I'm going to be talking about. And I want to try and get inside the heads of the people, the kind of colonial authorities, the Portuguese and the British, who looked at these islands and saw different things. And so we're going to explore the Seven Islands idea, but we're also going to put a big question mark over the whole notion of how many islands there were. I'm not going to give a very firm answer to that because it's a bit ambiguous. So I'm going to be talking about geographical conceptions. How do people understand the environment around them? That's going to be the focus. So we're going to be exploring how Bombay's topography was ambiguous, explore why that was. We're going to look at how these understandings changed over time. And then I will be talking about the land reclamation that took place as well. Why did it happen? And then I'm going to end by thinking about, what does all this mean? How should we remember these events? Okay, so let's return to that Seven Islands map. Is this correct? Was Murphy right to uncover that Bombay was once seven islands? And the interesting thing here is you see this map, and it's very appealing, very clear, but it actually conceals a lot of uncertainty. And in fact, Murphy's research that produced the map is a lot less certain about what Bombay looked like than the map suggests, because once you draw a map, it looks very clear demarcation between land and sea, seven islands, open shut. By the way, what you see to the north is separate. That's Southset. So we're talking about seven islands in the center here. Calabar, Old Woman's Island, Bombay, Mazagayan, Parel, Mahim, and Worley. Murphy's research actually says, oh, there were at least two, perhaps as many as six. And then by the time the map's produced a few years later, suddenly there are seven. It's all a bit confusing. But once the map emerges, then that becomes the accepted idea and is reproduced a lot, quite a popular map. Now let's talk about why it's more complicated than that. So this archipelago of islands changed with the seasons and with the tides. So during the monsoon season, as residents in Mumbai well know, the harbour would flood the creeks and the breaches between these islands. And then over the rest of the year, those creeks would silt up, and temporarily these islands would be united, so you can just pass across between them. But then it's even more complicated than that, because there's also spring tides. So twice every lunar month, the tide rises to the point where water then flows in again. So it's a constantly shifting landscape. For some portions of the year, this archipelago is actually perfectly navigable on foot. You can just walk across and it feels like one island. And at other times, they're separated. And in the center of this archipelago, we have an area of mangrove forests, tidal flats, and also man-made salt pans. So this land was used, and then that area gets submerged at certain seasons. So it's a shifting landscape. And therefore, what constituted distinct islands was largely subjective. It's in the eye of the beholder. Is Bombay connected to these other places because it sometimes is, or even most of the time is? And if we look at the history from the Portuguese period onward, we can see that subjectivity and a whole array of different interpretations of these islands. So Bombay was under Portuguese control, colonial rule, from 1534 for 130 years before the British came along. And during that period, there is no consistent Portuguese representation of the archipelago. There's no one way that these islands are understood. On the left here is the 7 islands that we've been talking about. On the right is one type of Portuguese depiction, which actually shows 4 islands, not 7. And it seems likely that something like this was more like the state of affairs when the British came along. So it was not 7 islands by the time of colonial rule. But then again, there's other Portuguese sources. So just to show a copy of a Portuguese map that shows these 4 islands. But then there are other Portuguese maps and written descriptions that seem to describe the H-shaped island of Bombay as being separate from Mazagain. So that's confusing because it's not what the maps show. And then there are other Portuguese sources that seem to suggest that Bombay is connected to Mahim. So it's all over the place. And I think the only way that we can really understand why it's so unclear is that under the Portuguese in the 1500s and 1600s, it doesn't really matter how, this isn't a particularly important thing defining these islands for the Portuguese. I mean, one thing that we've been doing so far, looking at these maps, is looking at Bombay on its own, these islands on their own. But actually, it was part of a much wider region. So for the Portuguese, those small islands were part of what was called the Northern Province. And it was actually more than what we see on this map. But on this map, you see the wider Bombay harbour area, and Bombay Islands are here. But you have the much larger island of Southset, and then you have the local capital, Versailles, or Versailles, at the top. And this is north to the left. I'll just switch to a modern map that's a little bit clearer, showing the wider area. So once you zoom out, you see that it's a little bit artificial to even call this the islands that became British as an archipelago on themselves, because actually they're part of a wider archipelago. There's nothing, it's not a territory that's separate from the other islands. And within that larger context, it's not a particularly important place under the Portuguese. you have, I mentioned that you have a local capital at Bassein, sorry, regional capital, and then really the most important local place is actually Mahim, not Bombay down here, which was a fairly small town or village. And the consequence of that is that there are multiple definitions of what Bombay was, because there was no need to define it. So Bombay, the Portuguese tend to call it Bombay with an M at the end, but obviously these are all variations of the same name of Mumbai. Was a village. It had the Mumbai Devi temple, which gave it some importance, and that was quite a small local designation of Bombay. But then there were bigger meanings that kind of emanated out of there. A jurisdiction, quite a small one, but under the Portuguese, that village collected tax over a slightly wider area. So Worli, for example, was subordinate to Bombay, so therefore it had a slightly bigger meaning in that sense. And the big one that makes the place name more significant is that because it's one of the first islands, it's probably the first settlement that you see when you're entering the harbour. Bombay gives its name to the entrance to the harbour, and that is when the English come along, and that's why they become interested in this place, because they're looking for a maritime base, and this is an excellent harbour. It's probably the best natural harbour in the whole west coast of India. And the English, therefore, they hear the name Bombay, they actually think it means good bay. So bay being another word for harbour, they think it's Portuguese for good bay, Bombay. And so they become really interested in it and think it's a more significant place than it actually is. And then they acquire it. And I won't go into all the details of how this transfer from the Portuguese to the English happens, but essentially in 1661 there's a marriage treaty between the two monarchies, the English and the Portuguese, and this place is transferred. It actually doesn't fully happen. The actual transfer happens in 1665, and the Portuguese hand over what they think of as Bombay, and it's just the area underneath the red line that I've drawn here. So it's not all of these islands that we understand of as being Bombay. Importantly, the Portuguese exclude Mahim, which is the more prosperous, more important settlement. And the English are outraged. They thought that this was a more significant place. And what happens is the English immediately seize Mahim and claim that it is part of Bombay. And so here's the first governor, called Humphrey Cook, say they is the Portuguese. So the Portuguese would have Mahim and Bombay to be two several islands. I think there he means two separate islands, but cannot well make it out. I never took boat to pass our men when I took the possession of it, and at all times you may go from one place to the other dry shod. I cannot imagine how they can make them two islands. So Cook is saying this is obviously one island. And then the Portuguese side, this is the viceroy saying, the first act of Mr. Humphrey was to take possession of the island of Mahim, in spite of my protests, the island being some distance from the island of Bombay. He argues that at low tide, one can walk from one to the other. And if this is conceded, your majesty will be unable to defend the right to the other northern islands, as at low tide, it is possible to go from Bombay to Salsette, from Salsette to Trombay, so that in order not to lose the north, it will be necessary to defend Mahim. And just to see what he's talking about there, go back to the wider map. The viceroy is saying, well, if you start defining islands in that way, in terms of low tide, then actually all of these islands are one, are united, and you can walk from one to the other at certain points. So this English argument is going to lose us the whole of this territory. This leads to decades of disputes between the Portuguese and the English, the Portuguese claiming Mahim, but the English keeping hold of it regardless. And what's interesting in terms of the focus of our talk, in terms of understanding geography and how people think about the geography, is that in order to construct a self-contained territory, a defendable territory, the English have to create a new geographical understanding of Bombay. They have to invent a new Bombay that didn't really exist before. Whereas before it was one village, now it had to encompass Mahim. And so what you see in the maps is a place called Bombay Island that had never been depicted before, that shows one island. So this is from 1685. This is before any land reclamation had actually taken place. But unlike all the other maps we've seen so far, the central area is land. It's shown as land, even though we know that for much of the time it was not. The English had to do this. They had to do this in order to make arguments against the Portuguese, for them to acquire more land themselves that could be defendable, that could sustain itself in terms of producing food for the colony. And so this really interesting thing happens where it's politics that changes the way that people perceive the environment around them, or geopolitics perhaps. And you can see the way that this is described at the time. And the English really have to, it's this quite tortured way that they have to think about the geography. So the East India Company Council says the island Bombay, by the breaches and overflows of the sea in several places, seems to make 4 small islands. The sea, by the said breaches, has eaten up about 1/3, and that is the best and richest part of the island, which yet by industry and some charge is recoverable. So this quote is already talking about land reclamation, because it's insisting that this is one island, but unfortunately the sea is in our island. It's completely overflowing 1/3 of the island. So the English think, understand this place as one island, Bombay Island. And that is quite a powerful, once they've conjured up that notion, has an impact on the way that they, on the actions that they make in that place and the environmental interventions that they undertake. Just to show a little bit more in terms of the maps and the effects that this has. This poor atlas creator, William Hack, has to try and work out what's going on here. He's producing an atlas of the west coast of India in 1700, and he's looking at different maps of Bombay. One of them is Portuguese and one of them is English, and he's seeing completely different things. And what he ends up doing is including both in his atlas. And it's a bit unclear if he even knows that this is the same place. It's not acknowledged in the atlas that this is the same place. So one is called Bombay, which is more like the Portuguese name, and one's called Bombay. So this is a story of I suppose, imperial conflict over how a place is perceived and understood. And it's partly a legal conflict, and they have various legal arguments about the land. But it's also this conceptual, who's going to produce the best maps, and then print them and distribute them and argue that this is our Bombay. And a little bit more about the kinds of disputes and the kinds of arguments that are happening. A couple of quotes, one from the Portuguese side saying that Mahim is a distinct island by itself and no part of Bombay. And then from a few decades later, 1706. So these arguments go into the 18th century. The English say, it is visible to every eye that will see that Bombay and Mahim were never yet separated by nature. So two sides are looking at the same thing and seeing completely different things. And it's interesting to wonder how much of this is artificial, how much of this is just they're saying it to make a point, or how much of it is that because Bombay's geography is changing, you can look at it and see whatever you want, and it becomes a genuine thing, a genuine perception. And I argue that because the English see this as an island, this is part of the reason why land reclamation actually happens. So the land reclamation starts in 1709, and it's right when these arguments are happening with the Portuguese, and they start with Mahim and unite it to other islands. And so it's part, you can see how they could be saying, well, okay, you say it's its own island, we're going to make sure that it's not. Although I haven't found any sources that explicitly say that explicitly link the land reclamation to the disputes with the Portuguese, but they are happening at the same time. And we have an image here from a bit later, but it does show these artificial sea walls, embankments that are constructed at the north of the island, and then this one here is between Mahim and Worli. That takes place in 1709, 1712. They then try and do the big one, which was called the Great Breach, and that was between Worli and Mahim. And they fail actually at first. It's too hard. And it's only later that they construct this massive embankment that we saw an image of earlier, that's later called the Hornby Ballard, and they do that between 1720 and 1728, and it takes far longer and costs far more money than they expected. And the East India Company is absolutely furious at the local council doing this and spending so much money on it. And in fact, they order it to be stopped before it's finished because they spent too much money. But the council basically ignores that order and finishes anyway. So we can see that story of Governor Hornby defying the East India Company is partly true. That is what happened. But for some reason, it's been shifted later to 1780, 84. And that's an interesting shift. And what I would argue is that by doing that, and perhaps the reason why that happened in the colonial period, so this is in the 1870s, the Victorian Bombay, is that by shifting it later, they could then attach this story of land reclamation to a wider story of the success of the colonial city and the growth of the city, which only really started to happen at the very end of the 18th century. And actually the reality is a lot less grand, because this early history of land reclamation was essentially a failure. So these sea walls, first of all, they don't do a very good job of stopping the sea. You can even see from this image that it's not particularly effective. And the whole reason for doing this land reclamation was to create agricultural land. But then the agricultural land that's produced isn't of very good quality and does not anywhere near recoup the losses made by investing in this land reclamation. So Bombay's early land reclamation was not actually about creating space for the city to grow. It was about creating agricultural land. And it's only later that I suppose land reclamation comes into its own because it creates the space for the growing city. But that's really only at the very end of the 18th century. So let's circle back to the Seven Islands model, to Murphy and his map. And what can we say about it now? Well, it's a rather complicated story, but in a way, the British had not forgotten that Bombay was once multiple islands. They never thought it was. As soon as they arrived in 1665, they saw Bombay Island as one island, excluding Colaba to the south. And they did that because they had to. It was a new geographical conception that contradicted what previous people, both in Marathi accounts and in Portuguese accounts, what previous conceptions of Bombay were. But in order to create the territory that they wanted, they had to create a new geographical understanding. So that's why Murphy was so surprised in 1836, because the British had always thought that this was one island. But once Murphy comes along, when Murphy comes along and says, actually, this was more than one island, by that time, in the 1830s, the need to insist that it was one island had gone, because the Portuguese had long since gone. They'd been driven out as Bombay's neighbours by the Marathas in 1739. So this dispute over Mahim was no longer around. The context had changed. Bombay was now this thriving city. And so as soon as this map was produced, then suddenly the land reclamation that had previously been a failure was something to celebrate, and was tied into these imperial stories of success. And all of these kind of I suppose this mythologizing, and that partly moves the story into the 1780s, and these grand narratives of remarkable environmental transformation emerge. So a couple of quotes here, one from 1902 saying that the islands were united by the genius and energy of man. And then from Samuel T. Shepherd in the 1930s, it may well be doubted whether the history of British achievement overseas contains anything equal to this epic struggle with the sea, which has been going on in Bombay for 2.5 centuries. So an epic struggle is what it becomes in that high imperial period of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And so therefore the Seven Islands is distributed as an image of, look what Bombay was like before the British came along. And in actual fact, it probably was not Seven Islands. By showing it as Seven Islands, it exaggerates the achievement of reclamation, or at least the early reclamation projects, because it was some of that work was probably already done for them when they came along. But then you get this wonderful, and I really recommend anyone who hasn't already go to the Baldaji Lab Museum raised relief map of Heptanasia, which kind of displays, and then it's paired with a map of Bombay Island after the reclamation was done. Just a way of kind of showing off that achievement, and then obviously that understanding of reclamation goes on. It gets these early reclamation projects that I was talking about become part of a wider story of the later reclamations that took place later. But if you focus on the 17th and 18th century, like we've been doing today, then you see a much more murky, complicated story where there's a struggle over what Bombay even is. The reclamation projects are failures on their own terms. They're failures, and it's not this grand narrative of success. And of course, what's happened in more recent years is that the wisdom of this kind of reclamation has come into question because of the environmental effects of it are becoming increasingly clear for the modern city. And so those 20th century stories of progress, reclamation as progress, we're perhaps beginning to question. So just to conclude, a couple of points about what we might learn from this. One thing is that we see that geography is always political. And in fact, the way that we understand the world that we look around us can be fundamentally shaped by politics and by those more human interactions in a way that we perhaps don't always acknowledge. That's why suddenly Seven Islands become one island. We can see that there are a lot of myths around Bombay's history. And my intention here isn't just to say, oh, this stuff is not true. Seven Islands, it's never true. The Hornby story. I don't just want to debunk myths. I think that we should examine the myths, because I think that they're just as important as the facts of history, because they shape how people at the time and up to today understand the world around them, and they have an impact on people's actions, perhaps even on the reclamation that took place. And as I was just talking about, this land reclamation is not it's not a straightforward story of urban growth and progress. Its early history is marred with those failures, and then it has this very complex legacy going into today. So thank you very much for listening. Just to say, if you'd like to know more, there is an article about what I've been talking about, research article that is open access, so it's just available online. There's the details there, and hopefully there will be a book that looks a little bit more widely about Bombay's early history, that should come out in about 2024, 2025. And do email me if you want to get in touch or have any questions. There is an email address on the article that is out of date. So unfortunately, I can't receive those emails anymore, so please use this one. But thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I think your conclusion was brilliant, that, how geography and politics is so related, so apt. Thank you. Thank you for that. There are a few questions, and I think more people are typing in. Renal Kabadia wants to know whether, apart from John Burnell's record, whether there are other records that we could access to better understand the land reclamation projects between 1709 and 1712.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, there is more than Burnell. Burnell is a great source. But yes, there are East India Company records. They are not they're not all there in this early period, particularly in the Maharashtra State Archives. There's not that much from the early period, but in the British Library in London, there's a bit more, and I've been able to trace the history of the reclamation from that. Not loads of detail, but we've got the basic facts about what happened. And it is, there's a lot more that could be said about it. There are so many problems with those early reclamation projects, and it's quite a bumpy road in terms of that history.
Thanks. Kaiwan has a question. He says that he's seen some Portuguese maps online, and those show causeways connecting between Mahim and Parel. Do the English records mention those as well?
There's only one English record that I'm aware of that does, and it's from the 1670s, and it's John Fryer and his travel account. And he says that the stone causeway between Mahim and Parel is in ruins. And I think what's interesting about that is that perhaps shows that the causeway was perhaps older than the Portuguese period. And I haven't done a great deal of research into the Portuguese archives, but it could be that it predates. Bombay before the Portuguese was under the Gujarat Sultanate, and then before that under various rulers. So it could be an older causeway, in fact. But yes, they did exist.
There's a question from another person in the audience who'd like to know whether any attempt was made to reclaim the land between Bombay Island and the mainland itself.
Not in the period that I'm 17th and 18th century. I mean, obviously, land reclamation is carried on and right across the 20th century, and so now Bombay is connected to Sussex, and then Not, and I believe that it's not, the Reclamation hasn't gone so far as to connect Bombay to the mainland, aside from bridges and so on, but not, that was not a colonial project to connect to the mainland.
So there are a lot of people complimenting and thanking you for a wonderful talk. Ashish says it was great learning about Bombay regarding history and geography together, and very insightful account. I had a question whether, what kind of technology or ability for reclamation existed with the Britishers at the time that can be attributed to any kind of, what kind of reclamation would they have done at the time?
Well, yeah, this is a really interesting element. And obviously, I didn't go too much into the reclamation itself, but first of all, they're not the first people to try and reclaim land in the area. Probably small-scale reclamation had taken place before, and that's it on the scale of creating, say, paddy fields, like rice fields, reclaiming very small areas of land. The British approached it through embankments, so just big big walls of earth, and then sluices, so in order to drain the water from the land, sluices, and where the water at low tide would drain out of the embankment and into the sea. So there was still streams going across the new Bombay Island, but then draining out into the sea. But then at high tide, a lot of this area probably was still, even then, even with the embankments, partially submerged. So it's you can also link it to this European history of reclamation. So the English are quite inspired by the Dutch, who in the 17th century are innovating in terms of reclaiming land from the sea and so on.
Sandesh has a question saying, is it true that the Portuguese officials who were administrating Bombay had no idea that Bombay was given to Charles I?
Yes, and that is true. So rumor reaches the local officials just before the ship arrives. I'm not 100% sure how they hear, but we're talking about literally just a couple of months before the fleet arrives to take over. So they are not consulted, and it's this centralized decision from Lisbon, from the court in Lisbon, to hand over Bombay, and the local Portuguese officials are absolutely dead set against it. And that's partly why then this dispute then continues for years and years and years, because those local elites, fazendars, estate holders, they previously had essentially owned the land that was then transferred to the English. The Portuguese crown didn't do much with that land, and suddenly they found themselves being forced out of the land. So there was massive opposition from those kind of Indo-Portuguese elites. As to why the Portuguese would do this, I think they thought it would be fantastic, because it was part of an alliance with the English against the Dutch, and the Dutch at this time were taking over large parts of the Portuguese Empire in Asia. And the idea was the English, they'd get a little bit of land and then they'd be forced to help out against Dutch. What actually happens is the English barely lift a finger to help them with Dutch and get this new territory. So it doesn't work out very well for the Portuguese.
Tinku Ray has a question whether the old maps show any mangroves that we see today, the ones that we see in North Mumbai and the Bandra area.
There's not that much detail in the maps, and I think more or less the answer to that is no, and it's probably because people at the time had no interest in mangroves, and this is part of the issue, that in terms of how we understand the environment. if we think about why the British did this radical environmental change, they thought of this space as wasteland. So they didn't think of it as sea, as we were talking about, because they think it's all one island. They call it wasteland. It's because they cannot use it productively for agriculture. It is wasteland. And so I think for that reason, we do not see depictions of of details of what it looked like, unfortunately, because it's just not what the cartographers were interested in.
Rashna Poncha would like to know if you found any late 18th century records in the archives in London or in Bombay, which tell us that Governor Hornby did not build the Vellard.
Yes, so I looked into this, trying to find where this account came from of him building the Vellard, and looked into the 1780s records from Bombay. And the only thing that seems to happen is a quite small repair project. So there is some work that takes place in that period in the 1780s to repair the existing sea wall. So maybe that is the root of the idea, but it's clear from the records that the seawall is complete by 1728, and that not much more happens with it, apart from small repairs from then on.
Sandesh Abdhan would also like to know if you could throw some light on why the British handed over Bombay land to East India Company.
Yes, so they did that in 1668, and this is a time when it's called the Restoration. So the English crown, Charles II, had just been restored to the English throne in just 1660, and then the next year he signs this agreement with the Portuguese. And this was a time when the new monarch was very ambitious to acquire an empire, basically. This is before there was a significant British Empire. And so he does all sorts of things, like he gets Tangier in the Mediterranean alongside Bombay in the Indian Ocean. There's the Royal African Company is established to participate in the slave trade. There's new colonies in the Americas. And within a few years, this all falls apart, really, because the crown is out of money. And they engage in a war with the Dutch that does not go well. And the crown is desperate for money. And so they hand over Bombay to the company in exchange for, I think it's a £50,000 loan. So it's a story of initial excitement. We're going to build an empire. And then within just a few years, all that ambition is gone because they've run out of money. And then it's the company that goes on from there as a private organization, run by London merchants.
Kaiman says that I saw a place named Kaiman on a few maps that you showed somewhere close to Mahim. And would you have any description of that?
So Salsette was the much more significant island because it's much larger, and it was it was described by the Portuguese as the granaries of India. So it produced grain, so it's agriculturally very productive, whereas the islands that we've been talking about around Bombay were mainly used for coconut production, coconut groves, especially Mahim, and then exported. And the interesting thing about that early history of agriculture is that this all works quite well under the Portuguese, because they get the grain from Salsette, and then Bombay can concentrate on what the land is suitable for there, which is exporting all the products that come out of coconuts. When the English come in, that system falls apart because they need Bombay to produce food for the new settlement. And so they tried to completely change it's not just the land reclamation, they try and change the whole space of Bombay in so many ways, and they again don't do very well, unfortunately. So there's a wider environmental and agricultural story here of the early history of the city. And my main takeaway from the 17th and 18th century is that it's a real struggle to make this place what the company wants it to be.
There's another question. Did you come across any records of how local rulers like Marathas, Mughals, etc. reacted to the handover of Bombay Islands to the British?
Yes, we've got this quite detailed account of Aurangzeb, the Mughal emperor, hearing about the English taking over Bombay and starting to build a castle there, fort, and through his authorities in Surat, trying to stop that from happening. This is right at the beginning in the 1660s. And the Mughals are opposed to the English colony throughout the whole period. And some of you may have heard of the siege that took place in 1689 that destroyed the early city. And that was the city, which was the admiral of the Mughal fleet, almost wiped out English Bombay. The Marathas too, I think the Marathas were less hostile because the Mughals had a maritime interest from Surat, and Bombay was a threat to that. Whereas the Marathas, I think, tried to use the English in Bombay as much as they could, and they invaded the Portuguese territory in 1739 right up to Bombay. But after that point, relations between the British and the Marathas were actually friendlier than between the British and the Portuguese. Obviously, with exceptions like in the late 18th century, then there's more warfare between British and Marathas, but earlier on there, it's fairly friendly actually.
Shashank would like to know if there's any record of land actually being reclaimed and used for paddy cultivation, because seawater would have been saline and therefore not suitable for agriculture.
Yeah, this is something that the British do not seem to have been aware of. So they talk about, we're going to make so much money, so much rice out of this land. And then when they reclaim it, they realize that, just as you say, the salinity means that their whole idea is unworkable, or at least it would take many years for that land, to become usable. Now there are a couple of references to like I was saying, small-scale reclamation before those seawalls in the 17th century, and I believe that some of that was used for paddy fields, but probably more common was using it to produce salt. So rather than reclamation, I suppose, creating salt pans with that land to get salt. Okay,
there is another question on whether you're aware that Mumbai was a seismically sensitive, whether anyone was aware at the time that it was a seismic zone.
I don't recall any references to that in this early period, and I think it's only in the 19th century that there's a more geological research, so in the second half of the 19th century, that starts to reveal that geological history of Mumbai, and that lends itself to these theories of this was once multiple islands, because they start to trace those geological shifts later, but no, not in the 17th and 18th century.
Okay, there is another question. Let's ask that as well. Was there any city or region governed by British Empire around the same time which had a similar reclamation being done?
I think what's interesting about Bombay is that it's a fairly rare example of this kind of environmental change happening this early. And I think that the reason you see that is because the English are desperate in this early period. they really struggle with those other forces that we were just talking about, Marathas, Portuguese, Mughals, and they're trying so hard to make this place work. Later, and I think in the late 18th century, you have reclamation around Calcutta. I think that only begins at the very end of the 18th century, and there has been some work on that. I haven't done any work on it myself, but this is an interesting example of a very early case.
I think Uzma says it for all of us, saying thank you for an interesting session, especially the part about reading historical records too with circumspection. I think that's something we all sort of got a reminder for today. And thank you to everyone else who's attended as well.